NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and some governments, there was a feeling that the end result was one-sided, and that the overall picture of the situation of human rights in Iraq was not addressed. Only a small part of what was going on in Iraq, what is going on in Iraq, was addressed in that special session, and the actions from the special session will focus almost exclusively on that very narrow purview. Our intention here today is to discuss the situation of human rights in Iraq from a much broader perspective, and because of that, we have two of the outstanding experts on the situation in Iraq for you today. We will begin with Ms. Haifa Zangana, who is an Iraqi author. She's a founding member of International Association of Iraqi Contemporary Studies and co-author of ESCWA 2014, the Arab Integration Report. I present Ms. Haifa Zangana.
Thank you very much. Is it working?
Yes.
Well, regarding the resolution, my presentation will be, I'm going to argue that atrocities did not begin in Iraq with the existence of Daesh, what we call Daesh in Arabic, which is ICIS, of the declaration of the Islamic State in Iraq. Atrocities on a large scale, in fact, being committed and unpunished since the beginning of the occupation of 2003 by the US-led occupation. So it goes as far as that time, but hardly been addressed in such a strength of what's called nowadays the global alliance in order to fight the IS on its own, as if raising the memory of what's happened. Our collective memory is going to be erased of atrocities happened before the 10th of June. I'm going to argue this case based on my knowledge of what's happening in Iraq. In fact, in some, if you think about it, we are documenting 4 cases, the events, the atrocities committed by the IS recently, especially regarding minorities, which we totally condemn, are mirrored by the atrocities committed by the Iraqi government and its militias. Recently, it's been developed, from the beginning of the occupation, we had a few militias. Those militias are well funded in Iraqi society because they are either pro the Iraqi government or part of political parties that attach to the government. So it's part of the alliance that's governing Iraq. Example are the Badr Brigade, Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq. Those are very brutal militias, still functioning with complete impunity in Iraq. None of the crimes committed by those militias ever being punished or anybody being brought to justice. But also recently, what's happened recently, because of there is a fatwa by the Marja'iyya, the high clerical in Najaf also, this fatwa declared jihad against Daesh, against the IS. So suddenly, instead of we having like 5 or 6 militias taking free hand and acting with complete freedom in Iraqi society, we suddenly have seen the sprouting of something like 19 militias. They are mostly because the high rate of unemployment, uneducated, so they were called upon, all of them, to jihad against IS, and these are paid money. The most famous of them was called a Salam militia. A Salam militia is an attachment to the المقتدى الصدر brigades. Salam, recently, if you have a look, which is very, very disturbing images on the YouTube, and it is really confirmed happening because they are very pleased about it. And they are bragging about the atrocities they are committing. They are exactly mirroring the acts of IS. So instead of fighting IS, the state of the society now, there is revenge. And the revenge is sponsored by the government itself, by the militias, by paying a salary of $800 for each person joining these militias. We have lists of the number of those 29 or more militias acting on the ground. In my presentation here, I'm going to also move on to a few other, just mentioning a few notes about the general situation, not just the militias and the atrocities and all. I give you this. The last 11 years have proved the total failure of US policy in Iraq, and the world definitely, as we know by now, and it's been confirmed, and I'm sure many of you've been predicting this situation before. The world is not safer than what it used to be before the invasion of Iraq. We were promised liberation, democracy. Now the whole area, the whole Middle East, the whole, in fact, I mean, they claim the whole world is dangerous, more dangerous than what it used to be. Some of the atrocities committed and the crime committed by the new militias, the sprouting militias, on the 17th of June, members of Asa'ib al-Haq, it's an armed group, entered Al-Wahda police station in Qatun area of Diyala, and they executed 48 detainees. So what they're doing now is they're killing the prisoners, the detainees who are in prison, because no one is defending them. There's no one is responsible also, never been held responsible. They're attacking prisons and they're killing. Officers working in those prisons are collaborating and helping them in those massacres, which been documented in a major report by Human Rights Watch giving full details of it. Also another prison, I'm talking about also the same report, the security forces and militias affiliated with the government, they were executed at least 255 prisoners. 8 of them were boys under 18 in 6 Iraqi cities and villages since June the 9th, 2014. Joe Storr is the Deputy Middle East Director at the Human Rights Watch, warned that, I quote, while the world rightly denounces the atrocities acts of ISIS, it should not turn a blind eye to sectarian killing sprees by government and pro-government forces, unquote. The Human Rights Report described the nature of the mass killing as, I quote, a revenge killings for atrocities by ISIS that could be evidence of war crimes or crimes against humanity. In such mayhem, while the condemnation of brutal crimes by IS against minorities and the destruction of monuments and religious places is a necessity. By the way, I mean, the destruction of monuments in Iraq did not start in June 2014. We hardly have any monuments remaining in Iraq since 2003. I've been working on collecting evidence on monuments because I'm a cultural also, I write on Iraqi culture and all. Hardly any monuments been, especially in Baghdad, before 2003 remain in Spain. It's all been destroyed. Nothing being left there. The new figures being erased in the state, which considered by many artists just really complete nonsense. It does not represent Iraqi art. But that does not justify at all the crimes committed by IS. But we have to look into the unabated crimes and massacres committed against Iraqi people, not sparing any minority or dissident who dares to protest since 2003. Regarding the Christians in Iraq, by the way, we had pre-2003 1.5 million Christians. By June the 10th, this is becoming almost like a landmark in our history now, is what's left of the Christians were 400,000, but no action was being taken by the Iraqi government to protect the Christians before that. The whole world now is talking about, which is a great thing, provided you don't look with one eye while looking aside when other crimes committed at the same time. It has to be on both. It has to be balanced in order to bring down justice to people. The US-led occupation and subsequent proxy Iraqi regime have been practicing either unilaterally or together no less than state terror against civilians, all civilians. In the aftermath of US forces withdrawal in 2011, over 1 million Iraqi security forces and police, in addition to the special forces attached to Prime Minister's office, mostly trained by the US and the UK, became the tool of murder, torture, rape, kidnapping, and revenge. I've been working in the field also of human rights, but I was presenting a paper recently on degenderizing violence in Iraq. And by that, I'm talking about how rape became a familiar tool to humiliate men in Iraq. It's not women. We talk about women rape. Most reports write about women rape during conflicts and war. But this is becoming such a tool now to humiliate and to break the will of people who dare to oppose. And there are so many reports by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, with testimonies recorded about male rape in Iraqi prisons, whether it was under the occupation directly or subsequently after this. This exercise in state terror, plus using Iraq as a battlefield to settle scores of US-Iran negotiations over nuclear power, has resulted in establishing the horrifying reality of today's Iraq. The reality of daily killings, the silent death due to long-lasting efforts, effects of US-UK depleted uranium, corruption, and the rise of a new generation. Actually, this is all resulting. We have the youth, our youth, traumatized youth, absolutely, who identify themselves according to their sect or ethnic backgrounds, not Iraqis anymore, and who are willing to avenge or die for their newly manufactured identities. This is totally different. This is absolutely new to Iraq and taking place in the last 11 years. Iraq has always been proud of being Iraqis. If I am a Kurd, I am an Iraqi Kurd. Iraqi is the president for anything else. After that, you are respected as you are, and there was complete respect for everybody. But now it isn't anymore. Major. Now we're having also the continuity for the last couple of years of the shelling of the cities. So it didn't start even with in June that the Americans took it on themselves to protect the Christians and the Peshmerga in the north of Iraq or the army or whatever. But the shelling of cities being practiced continuously on 5 major provinces in Iraq since 2011, and before that, Fallujah city is a good example of it. In Anbar province, almost 80,000 families, that's mean 500,000 individuals, have fled the province since January this year. This is a huge catastrophe. When you leave your house, it means your children, they cannot be attending school, you don't have enough medicine, you don't have anything, you feel security
you become really a fertile, young people become fertile ground for any kind of extremism. This is the way, actually the best way to radicalize people. If you have the intention of doing that, this is happening. If you have the intention of putting an end to it, so you have to look at a different way of dealing with these problems rather than things. Barrel bombs are used like in Syria, which are made from high explosive cement and metal parts packed into oil drums and are usually dropped from helicopters, and they are indiscriminate in their nature and violate international law. It's also been documented by many organizations, and they are the usage of unguided air-dropped bombs in populated urban areas in Mosul, Tikrit, Fallujah, and Al-Sharqa. These are documented. According to one of the reports of the Human Rights Watch, again, the attacks hit areas surrounding mosques, government buildings, hospitals, and power and water stations. Residents in Mosul, Sharqa, and the oil refinery town of Beji described a pattern of intensifying strikes throughout the first half of July. This is after also the 10th of June. So all these crimes should be looked upon, should be investigated, should be seen to in areas where groups of civilians has guns. This is it. How did all this begin? Why this air bombs, the shelling of the city and everything happening? It's began with a simple thing. It's few hundred people demonstrated in both Anbar and Nineveh in December 2012 at the news of rape of women. And the demonstrators were carrying all banners asking for the release of women detainees. And the number of them, again according to international human rights thing, there were 4,500 women detained, either being accused as a terrorist, potential terrorist, or relatives of terrorists, or to force their relatives, so they are actually hostages, or to force their relatives in order to surrender to the government security forces. This is the demand of the people, the initial demand of the people. Had it been met with understanding by the Iraqi government, had it been investigated and looked at, things would have moved a different way, but it did not. On the contrary, people were punished, people were killed, a few massacres followed, Al-Hawija massacre, people were killed there, and followed by also this. All this, on top of all that, the big problem now in the society is that people of those 5 provinces and other cities are looked upon as terrorists. They are labeled by the government forces, by the government special forces, and treated accordingly. They are terrorists, no matter what they claim, no matter what they say, how they are arrested, and there are laws which is really anyone is eligible to be a terrorist. You can be arrested any minute. There is Article 4 of anti-terror law, which no one can dispute or argue about. With the lack of access to lawyers and all, you can be in prison for many years without any justice taking place. So no wonder people are unruly, people are marginalized, people have no say in what's happening in their country, in their own country. And the Iraqi government is appealing to the outside world because it has no root within our society itself, within Iraqi people themselves. Otherwise, with an army of 1 million, nearly 1 million armed security forces, police, and yet city after city falls in front, during few days,
with an organization called ISIS coming. It's a very strange scenario, but it happened with the result we see. I'm going to conclude. I think it's very important that I read the first address of the High Commissioner recently, the High Commissioner Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, when he called on international community to take further steps to curtail impunity for human rights abuses in Iraq and analyze the underlying patterns of violations and discrimination at the root cause of the conflict. This is very encouraging step, very important step. However, I don't think this is enough. When it is confined to certain date, which is the 10th of June, without looking at the full picture of it, it's like you have someone who's suffering from cancer and you give them paracetamol, painkiller. That's it. You are giving on no real treatment to the cause of this. I think all Iraqis, and I hope you agree with me, that all Iraqis have the right to live normal lives in dignity and free from the infringements to their rights caused by sectarian, kleptomaniac governments, corrupted governments, unsupported by the same governments that invaded, destroyed Iraqi state, and nurtured the sectarian divide. In conclusion, I say the recent resolution, if not applicable to all Iraqis, it's going to be seen by Iraqis as divisive, really. It's on behalf of certain community, of certain sect, of certain people, rather than the whole Iraqis. This is not going to be the solution. The solution is to treat all Iraqis equally. After all, I mean human rights for all citizens.
Thank you very much, Haifa. I'm going to introduce Mr. Sabah Al-Mukhtar in a sort of an unusual way. We've been in the trenches on the situation in Iraq for many, many years, starting with the first Gulf War, the imposition of sanctions, the discovery of what depleted uranium really does as a weapon. We both commented on the atrocious comment made by Madeleine Albright about whether the death of 500,000 Iraqi children in the course of a few years was worth the results obtained by the sanctions, and she said yes. We have raised the situation in Camp Ashraf and now in Camp Liberty repeatedly at the Human Rights Council in written and oral statements and discussions with rapporteurs, etc., to no avail. With other organizations, we submitted joint written statements over and over, 3 and 4, sometimes a session, on all of the situations that Haifa has raised. We have all worked on these together, and until June, they fell on deaf ears, essentially, into the geopolitical miasma that the West visited upon Iraq. Right now, Iraq is in a free fall. It reminds me of Somalia, a country with which I also work. Somalia is broken apart into little territories with warlords and different groups over here and different groups over there, and outsiders and insiders, and essentially a vacant central government. Iraq feels the same way. It's probably going to be worse before it gets better, and I'm not certain it can get better for a really, really long time. Key to the presentations of all of these have been Mr. Sabah Al-Mukhtar, who's president of Arab Lawyers Association. He's from the UK, but that introduction is very, very shallow in light of the years in the trenches we have spent trying to get the situation in Iraq in a place where the United Nations could actually be effective. I now present Sabah Al-Mukhtar.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all for coming. I'm grateful for you to give us the honor of listening to what we have to say. I would like also to recognize my friend Jeremy Corbyn, who's a member of the British Parliament, who is also present here. What I will try and do is to talk about three topics. First of all, I would like to make a short reference to the UN resolution, to the Human Rights Council resolution, which is S22/1, which was made on the 1st of September. I'd like to make quick comments on that one. In the first instance, this is a resolution which talks about the human rights abuses from a particular date. It talks about human rights abuses from the 10 June 2014.
Excuse me, it's making an echo. I don't know why.
Your line.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's no echo now. Yes. So this resolution is making a reference to the abuses of human rights post 10 June 2014. So does that mean that human rights abuses on the 9th and the 8th of June were not included? Does it mean all the human rights abuses from 2003 until 10th of June 2014, which is documented by UNAMI and the Human Rights Council? We've had statements from the many people on the Human Rights Organization, on the NGOs, on the Council, on the... It documented all the... So is this resolution saying that it's only these human rights after that date is the one that concerns the Council? The second thing is this. This resolution is dealing with a particular terrorist organization. But let me say here, there is no doubt, and no one should have any doubt, that ISIS or ISIL or IS, whatever it's called, is not a terrorist organization. It's a very serious and dangerous terrorist organization. Terrorism knows no boundaries. You can have terrorism anywhere and it will go everywhere. They don't need visas, they don't need passports. However, when one looks at the Human Rights Council addressing the terrorist act of one group only, does that mean it's exonerating the other terrorist groups? Whether before or after June the 10th? In Iraq there are something like 40 terrorist organizations. I'm sure people who have the technology and the YouTubes and the WhatsApps and what have you, you can see all these horrendous pictures of beheading and what have you. Please don't believe that the only beheading was for the journalists, the American and the British journalists. As abhorrent as it is. But does that mean that the Human Rights Council only cares about the abuses by certain people, of certain people? If you are a Muslim, then you have a problem, you will be beheaded. And if you are not a Muslim, then you have another solution. This is the creation of the ISIS. But let me tell you about a little more to try and understand ISIS. You know, it is being represented, ISIS is the biggest threat ever. It's even bigger than Al-Qaeda. And we've heard President Obama, no less, I'm talking about the President of the United States of America. He's the real top guy. He spoke to the American nation and he explained to them about ISIS occupying, if you didn't know, there's something called Mosul Dam. They said they occupied Mosul Dam and they're going to blow it up and there will be waves of 6 meters which will smother Mosul, and then it gets to Baghdad at 2.5 meters, it will kill 1.5 million people, etc., etc. Then NATO came in and they liberated Mosul down. That is what Mr. Obama has said. Now, Mosul Dam is not a bridge. It's not a building. You can't blow it up. It's a huge construction which is very heavy, very wide, very long. Daesh, or ISIS, had 5 people at the eastern side with a black flag, and they had another 10 people at the other side with a black flag. That is how ISIS occupied Mosul Dam. And then we had NATO to liberate it, because those 15 guys, they just disappeared. So that's the liberation of Mosul Dam. I'm saying this, I'm not trying to underestimate the importance of the threat of ISIS, because ISIS had behaved in a way that no one would do it. You don't move tens of thousands of people from their villages and towns because they are Christians or they are Yazidis. You don't go on blowing up statues and mosques because you believe terrorist. And I mean mosques. They did not blow up churches. They blew up mosques for Muslims because they said in their philosophy of Islam, their understanding, it's a bad. Now, ISIS, let me give you an anecdote. A friend of mine, he lives in Mosul, he's a lawyer. He's my age, he's retired, he has a small, his garage he converted into a shop so that he can sit there and see the world go by. I phoned him, I regularly phone him, and I asked him, how does it feel to live under ISIS land? And he actually didn't enjoy the joke. And he said to me, let me explain to you my life rather than giving you what ISIS is doing, good or bad. He said, for 10 years, he said to me, listen what I'm saying. For 10 years, since 2003, not 2014, I have been paying $50 every month to ISIS, ISIL, Qaeda, or whatever it comes in, whatever name. Because I'm sitting in the shop, they come to me and they say, you know, you are in danger and what have you, so I pay them $50. He said, and at the same time, I have the police of Maliki, of the government, they come to me and they say, you know, you have some suspect characters come here and we need to make sure that, he says, so I pay them $50. So for the last 10 years, he's been paying $50 to ISIS, in whatever its name, and $50 to the police, so that he gets. So he said, when ISIS took over, I'm $50 better off a month. He said, I don't pay the police, I only pay ISIS. He said, but I have 2 problems with ISIS. He said, you know, I'm not religious, I don't even go to the mosque. He said, but I have 2 problems with ISIS. So problem number 1 is that one of my daughters doesn't wear a hijab. They made her wear a hijab. And he said, my son's daughter, my granddaughter, she doesn't wear a hijab, and they made her wear a hijab, and these 2 girls were complaining. He said, so call them in, and I said, listen, for the last 10 years, you 2 girls, we were not allowing you to go out because we don't know whether you will come back or not, you will be kidnapped. Or. He said, at least now you can go out safely, only you have to put the hijab. He said, please tolerate this dramatic inconvenience. He said, and as far as I'm concerned, he said, every time I go out of my house, whether I go to the market or to visit my friend or to whatever I do, he said, I used to be regularly insulted and humiliated by the checkpoint which is put there by the police. He said, I'm an old man, they make me stand for an hour because they say that they want to check my identity. He said, I'm a person who's known in the street I live in. He said, they make me say things about the Sunnis and all sorts of other things. He said, it was such an insulting, humiliating thing. He said, I promise you, since ISIS came here, he said, nobody has said to me a bad word. He said, on the contrary, every time I come to the checkpoint, because I'm an old man and they call me Haji, they say, Haji, go ahead. He said, I do. He said, The problem I have is with my daughter and granddaughter. He said, the other one which pains me is that they blew up the mosque, which was across the street from my house, since I was born. He said, it's a beautiful mosque, and I don't know why they blew it up. I'm not saying it's good. Life is bad. But for Prime Minister David Cameron of Britain, or Monsieur Hollande in France, or Obama, to say that they are suffering from ISIS is a little bit tall. It's much. It's the Iraqis who are suffering. It's not those guys. So for them, when they moved into the next step, is that we have to rid the world of ISIS. And you say, yes, it's a very good idea. How are you going to do that? So we start having, first of all, a bombing campaign. And you wonder, how would you fight terrorism from the air? What do? You send an F-16 to bomb a vehicle with 4 criminals in it? Is this how you're going to fight it? And then, how do you know those guys are an ISIS guys? If they're not carrying the black flag, how do you know they are ISIS? What is an ISIS thing? Now that we talk about an inclusive government, President Obama came out very, very clear, very well. He said that this government, the problem is not with this. This is a symptom of the problem, and the problem is that the regime, he didn't say it, I'm saying it, the regime we created in Iraq was a bad regime. It abused people, it discriminated against them, it's corrupt to the core on every level. And of course, when you have a regime like that, you create a problem, and the people, everybody will be against you, so they will go for anybody like my friend that I said, he said, you know, they're better than the government. I don't like them, but this is the lesser evil. This idea that now we begin the bombing campaign. Okay, so they bombed few people when they were in the desert or on the mountain, but how are you going to deal with it in the towns and cities? So everybody, we start having this new idea of the conferences. Once it's a coalition, once it's an international conference, Hollande make it sure that he puts his foot, he makes the conference before the Americans do, and then we call on the Arabs and the Muslims, it's their bloody problem, they have to sort it out. But nobody actually is saying, what do you do? How do you go about that? In the previous times, we had the Saudis and Qataris and UAEs and Emiratis, and they were pouring money. The war which we had in 1991, in 1991, it was a profit-making war for the United States of America and Britain. The money we spent from British taxpayer, we got it all back, I think. And the Americans did send, because they were paying the money. Then we got into the situation now, okay, you pay money for who? To do what? So the conference is that now we are very excited that the Egyptians are coming on board. And you say, yes, and what the Egyptians are going to do? They don't have money to give you. They're not going to send soldiers. And the British don't want soldiers. And the Americans don't want it. And I think Kuwait would probably hesitate, and the UAE. So it is left, who's going to fight those terrorists? We have to go on the people locally. Okay, so we started with the Peshmerga. Peshmerga is the army which is of Kurdistan, the Kurdish army. Those people, believe it or not, they are really not such an enemy of ISIS. Not because they like them, they don't like them at all, but because they say, why are we fighting them? You know, if they don't come here, what is the interest behind that? But nevertheless, they could, provided now the militias that the government is sending behaves in a way that is acceptable to the Peshmerga. Because now the militias of the government and the army of Maliki, and believe it or not, Maliki, until last week he was in charge, but Maliki was promoted from a prime minister to a vice president. And because my friend Jeremy and I are British citizens, and probably there are others, we actually feel very proud as British, because the president of Iraq is a British citizen. The prime minister of Iraq is a British citizen. The vice president of Iraq is a British citizen. The deputy prime minister is a British citizen. 6 ministers are British citizens. We have something like 10 senior politicians are British citizens. We have something like 20 members of parliament in Iraq are British citizens. But hold on, our David Cameron, our prime minister, announced, because in his effort to fight terrorism and eradicate ISIS, he is not going to allow any British citizen who is involved in terrorism in Syria or Iraq from coming back. Now, maybe he will not go along this line, but this is what he said. But at the end of the day, I'm wondering whether all those, my countrymen, the English, the British guys, whether they can come to Britain or not. People talk about the change in the government in Iraq. Let me just explain to you the situation generally speaking. There is a political party, it's called Hizb al-Da'wa party, it's the Da'wa party. This is an Iranian established political party. Not now, it was established in, I don't know, in the 80s. It is created by Iran, financed by Iran, controlled by Iran, run by Iran. This was the government of Maliki. It had 2 senior guys. The most senior was Maliki. The second senior is Haider al-Abadi. So now, Maliki went out to become vice president, and Haider al-Abadi came in. And he is doing exactly the same thing. Anybody who has the names of the politicians, and you can find them on Google. If you look at the government of Maliki, or the names of the politicians during the Maliki era, and you look at them now, you will find they are all the same. But they have moved places, and this applies incidentally to everybody. It applies to the Kurds and to the Arabs, and it applies to the Shiites and to the Sunnis, and it applies to the Christians and the Yazidis, and everybody. It's just a musical chair exercise. Now, the policy hasn't changed. There were very simple, and I think you may agree, reasonable demands from Haider al-Abadi. They said to him, can we please forget about giving people rights and making a cabinet which involves everybody? Can you first of all stop bombing the cities? Because he's been bombing at least 10 of the cities in the north and in the west. And the bombing, don't believe it's Daesh or ISIS. It's hospitals, schools, mosques, houses, people, civilians. And these are, it's not propaganda. These are real figures. So the idea was he must stop the bombing. But how can he stop the bombing when Mr. Hollande and Mr. Obama and Mr. David Cameron and I don't know, everybody else is saying, no, we'll have a little more bombing. So now, it's fine. You can bomb anywhere in that 2/3 of Iraq, and you say you are fighting ISIS. Doesn't matter, you may kill children, but children could also evidently be ISIS, because they are all being accused of being ISIS. So the government was asked to stop the bombing, which is not very unreasonable. They were asked to release something like 10,000 women detained, not because they've done anything, but because I'm a criminal and I've run to Erbil or Jordan or wherever. They take my wife or my child or my mother or whoever. She's detained until I come back. So you have 10,000 women who are detained for that reason. We have something like 20,000 minimum people who are in detention, who have not been charged with anything, they have not been investigated by anybody, and they have not been tried for anything. So the call on the government was, can you please either charge the people or release them. You can't just keep people like that. And we want to stop the American bombing on Iraq, because the American bombing, maybe the American bombing is hitting ISIS, maybe. I'm not sure, I don't know. But the government and the Iranian airplanes, and now the Syrian airplanes, are bombing the Iraqi civilians on the basis that this is the war on ISIS. And I will just leave you with one thing. Please try and remember a few years back when we had Mr. Bush Sr. declaring war on terror without a limit, without knowing the address of terror. We don't know what's terror, but then eventually we decided terror is Al-Qaeda, and they were in Tora Bora in Afghanistan, but they're no longer there. And it didn't have a time, because everything you have a plan, you wanted to achieve something. I think we are heading for another one, and I think this is how it seeds the seed for terrorism, which is exported out of the areas under that one. And I think it doesn't solve the problem. The Iraqis are the victims of ISIS. It is not the British or the French or the Americans or the Europeans, not yet. But they are not the victims. And unless we try and help the victims and stop accusing the victim of being a terrorist,